The house felt like a hollow shell the day he left, the air thick with a stillness that hadn't been there before, a quiet not of peace but of absence, pressing against the walls until they seemed to bow inward under its weight. I stood in the kitchen, my hands gripping the edge of the sink, the cold metal biting into my palms as I stared out at the backyard where the grass had grown wild, untamed since he stopped caring, since the fights turned to silence and the silence turned to nothing. He'd packed a bag that morning, his boots thudding across the floorboards, his jaw set in a line I'd learned to hate, and he walked out without looking back, leaving me with 6 pairs of eyes that didn't understand why the door slammed shut. Thomas was 12, already tall and brooding, Emily 10 with her quiet stare, Jacob 8 and restless, Sophia 6 with her tangled hair, Oliver 4 and clinging, Lily just 2, her cries the only sound breaking the void he'd left behind. I'd married him young, too young, believing his promises of forever, but forever crumbled under years of shouting, of empty bottles, of nights I'd spent alone even when he was there, and now it was just us, a fractured family in a house too big for what we'd become. The divorce papers came a week later, a thin stack of words that severed what little thread still held us, delivered by a man who didn't meet my gaze, his knock sharp against the peeling front door. I signed them at the table, my pen scratching across the page, the ink smudging where my hand shook, and I felt the weight settle deeper, not just of him gone but of everything ahead, the years I'd face alone with 6 children who needed more than I had to give. The lawyer had muttered something about support, about him paying, but I knew better, his pockets were as empty as his words, and the last I'd heard, he was halfway across the state, chasing a life that didn't include us. I folded the papers, tucked them into a drawer I wouldn't open again, and turned to the sink, the dishes piled high from breakfast, a mess I couldn't keep up with, a reminder that life didn't stop even when it broke apart. I moved through the days like a ghost, my body heavy with exhaustion that sank into my bones, my eyes burning from nights I didn't sleep, listening to Lily's whimpers through the thin walls or Jacob's footsteps pacing the hall. The house was chaos, a tangle of noise and need, Thomas slamming doors, Emily asking questions I couldn't answer, Sophia spilling juice on the floor, Oliver tugging at my skirt, Lily screaming for a bottle I hadn't warmed yet. I'd cook what I could, scraping together meals from cans and stale bread, my hands trembling as I stirred, my mind numb with the endless list of what they needed, shoes for Jacob, a coat for Emily, medicine for Lily's cough, a list that grew while my paycheck shrank, the factory job barely covering rent, let alone the life they deserved. I'd sit at night, the kitchen dim, counting coins from a jar that never filled, my fingers tracing the worn edges, knowing it wouldn't stretch far enough, knowing I'd fail them in ways I couldn't fix. The neighbors stopped coming by, their visits fading after the whispers spread, divorced, 6 kids, poor thing, and I felt their pity like a stain I couldn't scrub off, their eyes glancing over the overgrown yard, the cracked windows, the toys scattered like wreckage. I didn't want their casseroles or their stares, didn't want them seeing the laundry piled in the hall or the way Thomas glared at me like I'd broken something he couldn't name. I'd sweep the floors, my broom catching dust and crumbs, my back aching from hours on the factory line, and I'd hear them through the walls, Sophia humming, Oliver laughing, Lily babbling, a chorus of life I'd made, a life I couldn't hold together. I'd collapse on the couch, the springs digging into me, my hands resting on my lap, and I'd stare at the ceiling, the cracks spreading like veins, wondering how I'd carry this alone, how I'd keep them safe when I couldn't even keep myself whole. The mornings came too fast, the sun barely cutting through the fog before the house erupted, a storm of footsteps and voices that pulled me from the shallow sleep I'd managed on the sagging couch. Thomas was the first up, his shadow moving through the dim hall, his silence louder than the noise that followed, Emily calling for her shoes, Jacob banging drawers, Sophia whining about a lost sock, Oliver tripping over toys, Lily's wails piercing the air like a siren I couldn't silence. I'd stumble to the kitchen, my head throbbing from the night before, my hands fumbling with the coffee pot, the bitter smell the only thing tethering me to the day ahead. The table was a battlefield, cereal spilled across its chipped surface, milk pooling where Sophia knocked her cup, and I'd wipe it down, my rag soaked through, my voice lost in the clamor as I tried to herd them out the door, their backpacks slung over shoulders, their faces smudged with breakfast they didn't finish. School was a reprieve, a few hours where the house fell quiet, but it never lasted. Thomas came back sullen, Emily with torn pages from her books, Jacob with dirt on his knees. Sophia clutching a drawing, Oliver trailing behind, Lily still at home pulling at my legs. I'd work the afternoon shift, leaving them with a neighbor who didn't ask questions, her house smelling of cigarettes and stale bread, her nods curt as I handed over Lily's bottle and a bag of clothes. The factory was a blur of metal and sweat, my hands sorting parts on a line that never stopped, my ears ringing with the clank of machines, my body swaying from the hours on my feet. I'd clock out, the sky already dark, and trudge home, the weight of the day pressing into my shoulders, knowing the chaos waited, knowing I'd walk into a house that never rested. I'd find them scattered, Thomas in the yard kicking stones, Emily hunched over homework, Jacob wrestling with Oliver, Sophia coloring on the walls, Lily crying in her crib, and I'd move through it, my hands picking up toys, my feet stepping over messes, my mind racing with what hadn't been done. Dinner was a scramble, potatoes boiled too long, meat stretched thin with gravy, the plates clattering as I set them down, their voices rising over each other, a tangle I couldn't unravel. I'd sit with them, my fork still, my eyes drifting to the empty chair where he used to be, a space that mocked me now, a reminder of the promises he'd broken, the weight he'd dumped on me. They'd eat, their hands grabbing, their mouths full, and I'd watch, my stomach hollow, knowing I'd skip my share to make it last, knowing they'd still ask for more tomorrow. Nights were a battle, getting them to bed a war I rarely won, Thomas arguing, Emily lingering, Jacob sneaking out of his room, Sophia begging for stories, Oliver clinging to my arm, Lily fussing until she crashed. I'd tuck them in, my hands smoothing blankets, my back screaming from the day, and I'd stand in the hall, the house settling into a hum of breaths and creaks, a sound that should have been comfort but wasn't. I'd sink onto the couch, the fabric worn thin, my eyes tracing the walls where paint peeled, my mind spinning with bills I couldn't pay, repairs I couldn't afford, futures I couldn't see. The factory cut hours that week, the notice slipped under the door like a threat, and I'd hold it, my fingers crumpling the edges, my chest tight with the math that didn't add up, the fear that clawed at me when I thought of losing this roof, this broken home that was all we had. The days blurred into a haze of motion, a rhythm of survival that left no room for stillness, no pause to breathe between the factory's grind and the house's demands, a cycle that wore me down until I was little more than a shadow moving through it. I'd wake to Lily's cries, her voice sharp in the pre-dawn dark, my body dragging from the couch where I'd collapsed, my hands reaching for her crib while the others stirred, Thomas grumbling, Emily shuffling, Jacob already tumbling out of bed. The kitchen was a mess before the sun rose, oatmeal smeared on the counter, cups tipped over, my hands wiping, stirring, pouring, my head pounding as I shouted them into coats and shoes, their voices overlapping in a roar I couldn't quiet. The school bus rumbled off, and I'd rush to the factory, my apron stained, my fingers stiff from the cold, the line waiting with its endless clatter, my thoughts drowned by the noise I couldn't escape. Work was a lifeline and a curse, the paycheck thin but steady, the hours long but never enough, my body bending under the strain of lifting, sorting, packing, my eyes burning from dust and fatigue. I'd see the other women, their faces hard, their hands quick, and I'd feel the gap. Some had husbands, homes, lives beyond this, while I had a house buckling under 6 children, a past that haunted me, a future I couldn't shape. The supervisor barked orders, his voice cutting through the din, and I'd nod, my head low, my hands moving faster, knowing a slip could cost me this, could unravel the fragile thread holding us together. I'd clock out, my legs leaden, the night swallowing the streets as I walked home, the wind biting at my face, the ache in my chest growing with every step toward the chaos I'd left behind. The house was alive when I returned, a storm I couldn't tame, Thomas throwing a ball inside, Emily crying over a lost book, Jacob climbing the table, Sophia spilling crayons, Oliver chasing shadows, Lily shrieking from her high chair. I'd drop my bag, my hands moving to fix what I could, my feet tripping over shoes, my mind numb with the endlessness of it all. Dinner was scraps, bread torn apart, soup watered down, the stove hissing as I stirred, their hands reaching before I finished, their complaints a hum I couldn't answer. I'd sit, my plate empty, my eyes fixed on the wall where a picture once hung, a memory of him I'd burned, a space that echoed with what we'd lost. They'd scatter after, leaving crumbs and noise, and I'd clean, my broom scraping, my back bending, my hands raw from the day. I'd lie awake after they slept, the house groaning under its own weight, my body sinking into the couch, my eyes tracing the ceiling where leaks stained the plaster, my mind racing with what I couldn't do. Thomas needed a jacket, Emily's shoes were splitting, Jacob's temper flared too often, Sophia's cough lingered. Oliver's questions never stopped, Lily's diapers ran low. The factory paid late that month, the envelope light when it came, and I'd count it, my fingers trembling, my breath shallow as I realized it wouldn't cover the electric, let alone the rent, let alone the food they'd eat tomorrow. I'd clutch the bills, my nails digging into my palms, my heart pounding with the fear that this was it, the edge we'd fall from, the collapse I couldn't stop. The house grew louder as they grew older, a cacophony of needs and tempers that filled every corner, a tide I couldn't hold back, its force pulling me under with every passing day. Thomas was taller now, his voice deeper, his anger sharper, slamming doors when I asked him to help, his eyes dark with a resentment I couldn't reach. Emily withdrew, her books her shield, her silence a wall I couldn't climb, her glances fleeting as she moved through the chaos. Jacob was wild, his energy a storm, breaking things I couldn't replace, his shouts echoing through the thin walls. Sophia clung to me, her hands sticky, her questions endless, her tears quick when I couldn't answer. Oliver followed Jacob, his laughter loud, his falls constant, his messes trailing behind him. Lily was walking, her steps unsteady, her cries a constant pull, her small body always needing more than I had. I moved through them, my hands catching, lifting, wiping, my body a machine that wouldn't stop, my mind a fog that wouldn't clear. I'd lost the factory job that spring, the line shut down with a notice pinned to the gate, a blow that left me reeling, my hands empty as I stood outside, the hum gone, the silence worse than the noise. I'd begged for shifts at the diner, the only place that'd take me, my apron greasy, my feet swollen from hours on the floor, the tips barely enough to keep the lights on. The house suffered, the roof leaking, the fridge humming weak, the bills piling on the counter, their red ink a scream I couldn't silence. I'd come home, the air thick with their fights, Thomas yelling at Jacob, Emily snapping at Sophia, Oliver whining, Lily sobbing, and I'd step in, my hands separating, my voice lost, my strength fraying with every clash. Dinner was a fight, the table too small, the food too little, their hands grabbing, their voices rising, a chaos I couldn't control. I'd stand by the stove, my back to them, my hands stirring what I'd scavenged, rice, beans, a carrot split 6 ways, my eyes burning with tears I wouldn't let fall, my chest tight with the guilt of what they didn't have. Thomas pushed his plate once, his chair scraping as he stormed off, and I'd watch him go, my heart sinking, knowing he blamed me, knowing he saw me as the fracture in their world. Emily stayed quiet, her fork moving slow, her eyes down, and I'd feel her distance, a gap I couldn't close. Jacob threw food, Sophia cried, Oliver laughed, Lily banged her spoon, and I'd sit, my hands still, my stomach empty, my mind spinning with the years I'd failed them. Nights were a collapse, their beds a tangle of limbs and blankets, my steps heavy as I checked them, Thomas staring out the window, Emily curled tight, Jacob sprawled, Sophia clutching a doll, Oliver kicking, Lily finally still. I'd sink to the floor, my back against the wall, my hands in my hair, my eyes tracing the dark, the house creaking with a weight I couldn't lift. The diner cut shifts, the landlord knocked, the fridge died, and I'd hold the last dollar, my fingers shaking, my breath caught, knowing it wouldn't buy bread, knowing they'd wake hungry, knowing I'd lost the fight to keep them whole. The air turned colder as winter crept in, a chill that seeped through the walls, a frost that settled into the house and into me, a heaviness that made every move a struggle, every breath a reminder of what I couldn't mend. Thomas was 14, his frame broad, his temper a fire I couldn't douse, his fists hitting walls when words failed, his eyes cutting through me like I'd stolen something from him. Emily was 12, her silence deeper, her books worn, her shoulders hunched as she carried a weight I couldn't see. Jacob was 10, his chaos louder, his defiance bolder, his hands breaking what little we had. Sophia was 8, her clinginess fading, her questions turning to stares, her small body shrinking into itself. Oliver was 6, his energy wild, his laughter sharp, his falls bruising more than his skin. Lily was 4, her words few, her cries constant, her hands reaching for a warmth I couldn't give. I moved through them, my hands cold, my steps slow, my heart a knot that wouldn't unravel. I'd taken a second job, cleaning offices at night, my body screaming as I scrubbed floors, my eyes blurring from the bleach, my back bending under the hours that stretched past midnight. The diner kept me days, the tips thin, the customers curt, my hands shaking as I poured coffee, my mind blank with the exhaustion that never lifted. The house was a ruin, the heat flickering, the pipes groaning, the windows rattling in the wind, a shell I couldn't hold together. I'd come home, the dark pressing in, their voices a storm, Thomas cursing, Emily retreating, Jacob smashing, Sophia whimpering, Oliver shouting, Lily wailing, and I'd stumble through, my hands picking up, my feet dragging, my soul worn to nothing. Dinner was a ghost, a slice of bread each, a can of soup split 6 ways, the stove cold when the gas ran low, their faces pale as they ate, their eyes hollow with a hunger I couldn't fill. I'd stand by the sink, my hands gripping the edge, my reflection faint in the glass, a woman I didn't know, a mother who'd lost the fight. Thomas left the table, his steps heavy, his door slamming, and I'd feel the crack widen, the boy I'd raised slipping away. Emily cleared plates, her silence a blade, her help a guilt I couldn't bear. Jacob kicked the chair, Sophia hid, Oliver ran, Lily clung, and I'd sit, my hands empty, my chest caving, my mind dark with the years I'd let them down. Nights were a void, their breaths uneven through the walls, my body slumped on the couch, my eyes fixed on the ceiling where ice crept in, my mind racing with what broke, Thomas's rage, Emily's distance, Jacob's ruin, Sophia's fade, Oliver's wildness, Lily's need. The office job paid late, the diner tips dried, the landlord's note came, and I'd hold it, my hands trembling, my breath gone, knowing eviction loomed, knowing I'd failed them, knowing the edge was here, the fall I couldn't stop. The spring brought no relief, the air still sharp, the house still crumbling, a weight that pressed harder with every dawn, a burden I carried alone, a life I couldn't reshape for them. Thomas was gone more, his shadow rare, his voice a growl when he returned, his hands scarred from fights I didn't see. Emily was a ghost, her books her world, her eyes avoiding mine, her silence a wall I couldn't breach. Jacob was a tempest, his anger a mirror of Thomas's, his hands smashing what remained, his shouts a knife in the quiet. Sophia was quiet, her drawings dark, her small frame fading, her need a whisper I couldn't hear. Oliver was loud, his chaos constant, his energy a storm I couldn't calm, his falls a mark I couldn't erase. Lily was bigger, her cries softer, her hands tugging, her eyes searching for something I'd lost. I moved through them, my hands worn, my steps heavy, my spirit a thread that wouldn't snap. I'd kept the jobs, the diner by day, the offices by night, my body a shell that wouldn't rest, my eyes sunken from sleeplessness, my hands raw from work that barely paid. The house held, the rent scraped together, the heat patched with a loan I couldn't repay, a fragile balance I couldn't trust. I'd come home, the dawn breaking, their voices rising, Thomas slamming out, Emily hiding, Jacob breaking, Sophia staring, Oliver running, Lily calling, and I'd push through, my hands mending, my feet stumbling, my heart steady despite the cracks. Dinner was a ritual, a loaf split, a pot of broth stretched, the table quiet as they ate, their faces tired, their hands slow, a moment I held on to, a flicker of us together. I'd sit with them, my plate bare, my eyes tracing their shapes, a family I'd fought for, a bond I'd kept alive. Thomas stayed once, his fork still, his glance brief, and I'd feel it, a thread, thin but there, a chance I hadn't lost him. Emily looked up, her eyes soft, her help a bridge, a sign she saw me. Jacob ate, Sophia smiled, Oliver settled, Lily reached, and I'd breathe, my hands resting, my mind calm, knowing I'd held them through this. Nights were softer, their beds full, my body on the couch, my eyes on the ceiling where cracks held, my thoughts on them, Thomas's return, Emily's strength, Jacob's fire, Sophia's light, Oliver's spark, Lily's trust. The jobs paid, the house stood, the debt loomed, and I'd hold the last coin, my hands steady, my breath even, knowing we'd survived, knowing I'd carried them, knowing this was us, broken but here, a life that went on.